Hello, everyone. I will be your facilitator. My name is Ramia Ismail. I am a researcher at Syria Research Policy Center. We know last February, an earthquake hit Syria and Turkey with devastating impact that is beyond a catastrophe. It had catastrophic impact on all. In terms of unemployment, there was a loss of 90,000 jobs because of the earthquake, and unemployment increased from 42% to 43.7%. And the biggest loss was in Idlib, with unemployment getting 59% after the earthquake. And in Aleppo, the number reached 47%. In terms of inflation, CPI increased after the earthquake, with monthly inflation in March 2023 between 2.4% and 10% all over the areas that were hit by the earthquake. And the prices increased, especially prices of food and prices of housing and alternative housing options at this critical period. Also, the earthquake impacted poverty level, with general poverty levels increasing notably during the earthquake period, especially in Idlib province. It went up from 94% to 97%. Also, the same applies to the sheer poverty, which is deprivation of food. The number increased largely from 65% to 76% in Idlib, and generally across Syria from 48 to 49%. This is in general the most notable losses that areas hit by the earthquake incurred, and my colleague Muhammad will present the response to the earthquake. Thank you, Muhammad and Wajdi. Despite those horrible impacts which were at scale, but the responses were disappointing. Unlike what a lot of Syrians were expecting, people thought this would reunify Syrians to go beyond political division and social fragmentation and economic deterioration. All powers, hegemony powers, followed their original policies, which aggravated the impact of the earthquake in the different regions. In general, the main characteristic of the responses by different authorities is to politicize the event and try to get the most politically and economically, and to score points against other parties. Also, different political parties that were centered around militarization and security, they couldn't use their resources to reduce the impact. In the government-controlled area, there was clear discrimination against earthquake hit, and there was a disclaim of responsibility for the areas outside the control of the government. Also, the government was slow to use its resources and to use international mechanisms to help those impacted. There was complete ignorance of the implementation of international support. The areas were not announced as catastrophe areas. Also, there was miscoordination, lack of efficiency in institutional operations, and corruption in the use of aids. Also, the catastrophe accelerated the process of relationship restoration between the regime and the Arab countries. There was lack of coordination and mobilization, including military mobilization. So the burden was thrown to the international organization and social or civil society. Also, some of those interventions were individually or done by individuals. There was focus on media mobilization for international community to send aids and aid groups, and there were not many efforts to help the displaced people. In terms of international response, the response by the UN was shocking because of the clear discrimination between Syria and Turkey, plus the difference in responses within Syria itself. The UN did not practice enough pressure to open checkpoints and didn't put pressure to send groups, although this is legal in catastrophe times. Approvals from different parties were waited for, which led to delay in sending aids. The first group of trucks, it was already scheduled. It entered 4 days after the earthquake from Bab el Hawa checkpoint, and they were supposed anyway to enter before that. The Turkish government responded slowly because it was focusing more on the response to the situation in Turkey, and also the Turkish hegemony over the decision-making in the interim government was impeding for the response. Bab el Hawa checkpoint was closed for 3 days, which delayed the arrival of the aids at the most critical times. So it was possible to exert more efforts to bring in aids, especially search and rescue teams and equipment. The United States had a response mainly focused on Turkey. It sent rescue teams to southern Turkey. It used Incirlik base, whereas it had no presence in Syria. The EU also responded very slowly and did not send search and rescue teams to the hit areas in Syria, but the EU organized a donor conference, and the Commission provided 3 million euros in the beginning, as well as the donors conference held in March. It provided 900 million euros as pledged money to help after the earthquake. Moving to the next slide, the bright point in the response was the response by the local community, because this response showed solidarity and cooperation, and it expanded immediately after the earthquake, and it was able to fill the gap left by the response of the local authorities and international community. Social solidarity was mainly characterized by high responsiveness. It was very humanitarian in nature, and it was across the different divisions that the Syrian society was suffering from. And this reflects a culture of social solidarity, which is deeply rooted in the Syrian society. Even conventional relationships like tribal and familial and religious relations, it supported this kind of solidarity and initiative. This was clear in Deir Zor, Raqqa, Dar'a, Suwaida, Hama, and different governorates. And even people used a lot of values like seeking help and providing help. Social solidarity took different forms across traditional relationships, across different areas, as well as transnational forms, especially with the societies outside Syria, Syrians and non-Syrians, to support all those initiatives. However, solidarity was impeded because of many things, including forcing donors and initiatives to get security approvals. Some activists were threatened, and no statistics were provided, especially for Aleppo, which did not help distribute aids. Also, the civil society was monopolized by authority-controlled institutions like the Syria Development Trust, for example. Based on that, or this bright spot caused by civil society initiatives, this will be commented on by my colleague Rabia, who will talk about the different development options. Thank you, Muhammad. And sorry because we are keeping you for a long time. But before I start, I would like to thank all the field researchers who have taken part before the earthquake and after the earthquake, because this is the main important part of this participatory approach that we have been using for 12 years at the center. We cannot be working without the society unless the researchers are really on the ground working with society at the highest level with high ethical values. So thank you guys for all the efforts you are doing. Secondly, I would like to thank all the key people or those who have taken part in the conversations or long interviews, and they know that this is research without incentives, no financial returns, not linked to any aids or support. It is just meant to improve the situation of the public situation. So I thank everyone who took part in this. And before this, I would like to thank Hazim Ibrahim, who is doing the interpretation. Thank you, Hazim. I will start with a main point, just as a summary of the situation and reading the damage of the earthquake after 7 months in the first and second days. For the civil society activists and how to work and how to coordinate. I think this has improved given what happened the last few years, but unfortunately, we are talking about a catastrophe at the institutional level because the major political powers have formed based on violence and security and military, especially the regime, which had squandered societies and besieging. It became a normal policy, and that it has proven not to be just exceptional and part of the military, but rather part of the policies of the public institutions, quote unquote. And this is the risk of the continuation of the heritage of war for the next decades, which we are seeing it every day in the form of instability in the country because of political tyranny, which is going on. And unfortunately, we don't have any promising models in the areas under the support of the opposition or the Northeast. The anger with this security-based and military-based model, although it differs from different areas, but during the earthquake, we discovered the gap and squandering of human value for Syrians. So in the first place, this is the biggest conclusion for us, is that we cannot continue to follow this squandering, unstable structure, and the political powers have shown how much they disregard all of this. If there was a war, the heavy military would have been moved by everybody, the regime and the different factions, to the front lines. But in the earthquake, it didn't happen. We had individual initiatives by people who have connection with other people, and there were simple initiatives. But putting full force and all potentials, military and economic and institutional, to save people, this was not there. It was not existing. This is just one example. We know at the Syrian society, during the earthquake, the level of shock would be higher usually. Secondly, we are talking about indicators and numbers, but we know the context and what each of this means for each person and for each human being. The simplest example is when we see people going back to homes that can collapse any second because of the lack of an option, because of the lack of hope, because of the size of despair among people. So the stories that translate what we mentioned and the amount of real suffering, both in terms of human and social suffering, are limitless. So we are not trying to just present them, but trying to show what they mean for Syria. What I would like to say in terms of alternatives is the following. First of all, despite solidarity feelings and actions among Syrians and also by international civil society and people outside Syria, but this was not translated into a change in the structures of the institutional powers. The reason is that we have political power supported by external powers. They suffocate the development in the country. So talking about a political change is not a cliche or not something imaginary. We are talking about political powers suffering from lack of stability that do injustice and repression in different forms until now. And therefore, we cannot think of change without thinking about political change, which is very necessary, especially with a society that is angry and rejecting this idea. But unfortunately, we don't have any channels to translate this anger into forms of transformation. So we are proposing small steps of development to help this transition. But the main idea is to change the structure of existing powers. Otherwise, we will be reproducing the conflict in different forms. Here we are talking about two issues to start with. The first issue is reinforcing social solidarity, having discussions among Syrians and rebuilding social links and restoring social confidence, especially that civil society, not just in Syria, but around the world, is playing an important role in providing services. It's a mediator between the donors and the local communities. And unfortunately, it is very far from being an organic part of society. So changing the role in order to play a role in the public sphere and represent the priorities of society and fighting for them and interacting with society, this is important to change anger and despair and fear and desperation into pressure that can be shown in social solidarity that can lead to political change of structure. This is the first issue we are proposing. It is there, but in a scattered manner. It should be more systematic and more institutional in nature. The second central issue is the economic structures and how they are functioning. We mentioned losses. It is around $6 billion. We didn't talk about the technical details here, but some of them are in the report and we can discuss them in further details. Let's assume we have $6 billion worth of grants. It doesn't mean we will be able to compensate for the losses, because this amounts will be reinforcing discrimination and tyranny, and we would have lost again. Secondly, the current aid system has mediators like the UN, INGOs, private companies, and some civil society, which is playing a mediation role here. So if $6 billion of money was granted, it will not mean $6 billion to compensate for losses. So we are talking about a system which has those two big factors: a distorted political system and an aid system which has different channels that doesn't lead to help society at the end. I will add to this the major problem, which is the idea of relief. For 12 years, we have been concentrating on relief. I believe this discussion is not proposed, but relief is not something to be discussed. But 12 years of relief, and each year you need more relief because you are not addressing the roots of the problem and you are not using a developmental approach. And this is what we have been talking about when we propose economic and social solidarity. Current civil society is relying on aids. This year we are seeing a reduction of humanitarian aid. Let's assume that we don't see any international aid. What will happen to society? What does society have? Like especially in the Northwest, hit by the earthquake, it will become an area that is unable to live. So high dependence on aids which is not turning into economic projects or social projects that are able to rebuild the economic and social structure, it cannot be beneficial to go beyond the impacts of the conflict and the earthquake. So we are focusing on turning relief into social and economic solidarity led by the Syrian society. This requires a lot of efforts because the formalistic or local initiatives of solving a problem in a region without networking or changing governance structure at the regional level, this leads to aid just being a short-term solution, not leading to long-term solutions, and it is being abused by war economies. This is just in terms of aids. It can turn into drivers for the economy inside, or drivers for improving the links between the regions, or putting pressure on the political powers, or putting pressure on the international powers to have a path where the priorities for political transformation are recognized. All what you saw in the research is about linking the earthquake to the Syrian context of what happened during the conflict, the mechanisms that surfaced. And I will conclude with one simple example. We saw huge aids come after the earthquake. However, we saw also a model of waste. There was spending, projects presented, and spending has to be done. But before the earthquake, we saw homes being rebuilt in the form of aid, which should look developmental in a developmental way. But those houses were built quickly in irregularized way, which meant people died during the earthquake because of this way. So any idea related to development is not just about social or economic aspects, but also it should be about governance. We cannot impose a political solution or impose 2254, the UN or Security Council resolutions. I'm talking about the both the local society and also improving the ability of refugees to coordinate on this. I will conclude here, and I hope we can hear a comment from Maya and Karam. Thank you, Wajdi, Muhammad Kiki, Muhammad Asadi, and Rabir. We will go now to comment from Karam Hilly. Karam is the head of Door Beyond War. He has a master's in business administration and has worked in worked with the UNDP on Mr. Karam, you have the floor. Thank you. Thank you for inviting me, and I thank everybody who spoke. I don't know if I can open the camera because I don't have a presentation. No one is speaking. They asked Karam to open the camera. Can you open the camera, please? Sorry, I was muted and I didn't know. Thank you, everyone. Again, thank you. And I would like to thank Syrian Research Policy Center for this valuable study and for my colleagues who spoke. It's not easy to comment on this paper for two reasons. First, it has a lot of technical aspects, indicators related to economic reality and services and social aspects, many indicators. Thank you for the effort you put on this one. Secondly, I would like to comment on the performance of Rabia and other speakers, and their clarifications are very clear and very detailed. I just want to comment on the paper. First, I will give an overview. Indicators were very good, and studying the earthquake and before the earthquake and after the earthquake was good, but the issue of social empowerment and social solidarity, I think it would have been important to add a new phase, which is the response after the earthquake, immediately, the social solidarity immediately after the earthquake, and see how long it continued. Maybe now the earthquake has happened 6 months ago. Maybe we would have loved to know if the solidarity continued or not after 6 months, because you said it is, yes, it's a natural catastrophe, but it will turn into a developmental and political and economic problem after the end of the natural catastrophe. But usually social solidarity appears, people have feelings for some time, but is this immediate support, did it continue? How did it continue? I think solidarity could have been studied over 2 periods rather than just one. The study in general, I will focus on governance and local community and localization, local empowerment. There was a statement mentioned many times, which is frustration from the way the countries have dealt with the situation, the neighboring countries, the UN, etc. But I want to focus on the United Nations. Should we really be frustrated, or should we be really shocked? For me, I believe that the problem with the UN is an old one. It is not shocking. It's not new. It's a continuation of a wrong mechanism that has existed over more than 12 years of the conflict in Syria. Until now, in the earthquake hit area, there is no UN office. There is no access to the United Nations, and many things that have happened after the earthquake, there's no stocks. In terms of the governance at the UN level, they should provide aids in case of an emergency. There should be a quick response without having to go into a politicization of the decisions, cross-border politicization. Every year we wonder whether the checkpoints will be opened or not. So there is a problem with governance that exists in the humanitarian work in Syria. It is highly politicized. There is a lot of negligence. For example, today, in preparation of this comment, I was reading about the deputy position of the humanitarian in charge of the Syrian situation. It was vacant for many months during the earthquake period. So we are a country that is suffering from a crisis over 12 years, but the most important position for the Syrian file, this position has been vacant at that time. Also, the issue we all know, the censorship of how the UN works, the procurement issue, the corruption, the fact that some regime-related powers being in charge or related to supplies of aids. Why I am taking long to talk about this? Because I want to move to governance issue. There's a lot of problem that happened in the response because of the weak governance. We had many projects that were meant to support governance in the northwest part of Syria, where I have more access. A lot of those projects stopped. They were stopped for different reasons, including Jabhat al-Nusra, which is classified as a terrorist group. But stopping governance projects led to the fact that you only have to work with local organizations and UN agencies, which increase the gap. So all the services, I mean, I cannot blame the governments. Of course, in Syria, we know whether it's the regime or other de facto authorities, I cannot blame them if the organizations give water, pave the ways. So I blame them, like Rabia said, on heavy equipment that were used for fighting, but were not used to save people for safety. So it is important to look at this. stopping governance projects, and projects or initiatives made at helping governance. This had a double punishment. Governance doesn't always mean government work. Sometimes it's social governance. What we saw during the earthquakes, I live in Turkey with access to northwest part of Syria, and the situation which existed during the earthquake, there was a lot of gaps. There was big solidarity. People were trying to take initiatives from the villages that were not hit. We saw a lot of work being done, but there was no coordination because something is missing, which is social governance. Where is the role of social leaders? Where is the role of dignitaries? Why are they not interested in working and organizing and coordinating among the different activities? Because honestly, the effort exerted in improving social governance or supporting social structure, whether it's the associations, the student unions, or voluntary groups, unfortunately, this effort or the financing or support to it is very limited, unfortunately, in comparison with the support that go to relief, just like Rabia said. So this absence of leadership and the lack of social governance concepts, which means local leaders will be the interlocutors between the authorities, all authorities and society. This is something missing and we need it more. And I think the study, in addition to the economic and social indicators, it could have did better analysis of those results. Finally, to comment on what Rabia said and link with it, to build a positive model of governance that achieves economic solidarity. If I want to create an economic solidarity, I cannot do it without confidence or feeling of feasibility. I will not have any development or economic solidarity model or project development. There will be no participation by society in those processes. So localization is very important and it is missing. This has become a buzzword that is being used since 2016, the pledge to move to localization. However, what happened is a support of civil society organizations rather than the local leaderships in the Syrian civil society. Actually, unfortunately, many organizations, because they were local, they turned some of local, just like we saw voluntary groups turning into NGOs. Now those NGOs that were local are becoming international organizations that is taking international version of governance, which means a separation between those organizations and the local community. Sorry, Karam, because of time pressure, I have 1 minute. I reached the conclusion, in order to reach development options, and just like our colleague said, for many years now, we are seeing increased spending on relief and less spending. So we have to address how to work with donors on how to localize governance. This will help us rebuild confidence and build local leadership that is able to function. I want to highlight few things. The research could have talked about few things because many people didn't have official documents which impacted ownership. So it is important to focus on this issue, lack of documentation and IDs and its impact on ownership of property and how it will impact in the future. I will conclude by saying that we cannot do economic transformation and reach solidarity economy unless we build two things: the confidence and the feeling of feasibility, because if this is not done through governance that supports society and shares the power of society, it will be difficult to achieve this goal, and we cannot do it unless society feels it is able to take decisions. They should take part in taking decisions, and the Syrian society feels that it is unable to take decisions, and this is something important we should work on. Thank you for the paper, and sorry I took a lot of time. Thank you, Karam. Thank you for highlighting on the issue of solidarity and response and governance, important issues to focus on. In the second comment, we have Dr. Maya Alrahabi. She is a doctor and writer and feminist writer and head of Musawa Group, Women Research Center. Thank you, Dr. Maya. First of all, I would like to thank the Syrian Policy and Research Center for this important research, which we lack a lot of scientific sources which tell us about the economic and social situation. So the report fills this gap. This is not new. Since 2011, all the numbers we are using from the Central Bureau of Statistics, which is related to the government, which also under pressure from security apparatuses and the government. So the numbers are not accurate. We saw the Human Development Index that came out before 2011 and scattered studies here and there. So this situation has become worse after the revolution. So we started relying on the assessment of social and political and economic studies on scattered studies that are not getting enough funding in order to do scientific research, apart from the difficulty of doing field research because of political and military siege by the regime and the de facto authorities on the civil society institutions and research centers, in addition to the lack of interest by international donors and the importance of this. We as feminist organizations, when we ask for university grants or help to do studies for the women's situation, we don't get any support if we were to ask for service projects. So in our studies and research, we are relying on the research produced by the Center Policy and Research Center and Syrian Human Rights Organization. And so I really value the efforts you exerted to produce this and previous reports. And also I understand that most of the references in the report were from research done by the center itself, because there are not many other references from other places, whether international or Syrian. I agree with a lot of things in the report, but I would like to draw your attention to one point. We are always talking about the Syrian regions as if they are under the control of the regime or the de facto powers. Actually, on the ground, it's different. There are huge areas of the Syrian rural areas are under the control of tribes with implicit agreements with the regime or with the de facto authorities, or just like the situation in Sweden, where there was an implicit agreement between the religious leaders and the regime, which now disappeared. This reality means that a huge part of the Syrian rural areas are run by tribal customs and traditions, which is based on violence and discrimination against women more than we see in the cities, because we know that tribal traditions are harsher against women in comparison with any other parties. And also we believe that tribal leaders support the de facto powers in their violence against women. And the incident which happened in Genderis with one of the factions leaders attacking a child. We saw the tribes issuing a statement justifying this attack. So this, I hope that in all your reports, you take it into account in all your reports. I was asked to comment and put some or give some gender perspective to the report. And this is one of the most important reports that did not ignore the gender perspective, but I want to stress few points. After the earthquake, we saw bigger economic collapse, as you said in the report. And before the earthquake, we saw a lot of poverty, which was higher amongst women, especially women that have dependents who were not ready to enter the labor market. And when they entered the labor market, they were subject to more exploitation and maybe harassment. And also in terms of uh, distribution of aids, they were subject to sexual blackmail. Many reports talk about this. I will not mention them now, but those who want them, I can provide them with. When we speak about health deterioration, we have to talk about reproductive health, especially that we saw a lot of deterioration in the reproductive health centers and hospitals and family control centers, and deterioration in the cadre, and having early marriage and the lack of safe motherhood and higher mortality rates among women, and the lack of reproductive rights for women. I believe this is very important and must be addressed or pointed to in any research about the health situation in Syria, whether before the earthquake or after the earthquake. In terms of the education catastrophe, even before the revolution, illiteracy among women was higher, 25% among women versus 19% among men, and with the percentages being higher in rural areas. School dropout because of the neoliberal policies before the revolution, the dropout was equal between male and female because of early marriage of women and young men being put into the labor market. But after the displacement and people became refugee, we reached a real catastrophe in the full sense of the word. But the impact on girls was more than boys because of early marriage and because of the lack of safety, which prevents families from sending their daughters to school at a time when those lucky boys were able to continue their education. In addition to the fact that in the northeast and northwest, people were sending their boys to take exams in the regime areas or regime controlled areas, but they were not able to send girls because they were fearing they would be harassed on checkpoints. In terms of the lack of community and social confidence, we have to say that we not only saw women being deprived of basic rights, actually we saw more violence against women. Even domestic violence increased as a result of people having arms, and because of violence and insecurity and the lack of accountability, both legal and social. And we saw new forms against women emerge, including rape as a tool of war, or different sex-based violence, including sexual slavery. We have documentation of many cases about this issue, people that we're not talking about, and all parties abducted women to exchange prisoners. We saw harassment at checkpoints, sexual blackmail of women to get aids. And also there was a big role for de facto authorities and the regime in a large part of those incidents. In terms of the impact on development and society, the report pointed out to the needs of the women in the early period after the earthquake, which emergency aids did not take into account. We saw a communique which was released by some feminist groups in which they asked international community to open checkpoints urgently, and we pointed out to the special needs of women. And in recent Brussels conference, we talked about the special needs of women and the importance of taking the nexus approach in all aids and relief projects. By the way, I was not shocked with the UN position, and not like what Karam said, 12 years. Actually, even before this, I was not shocked because the composition of the UN with the Security Council and full membership of countries that do proxy wars, I am not shocked with the position of the United Nations. The report mentioned that there were female activists who were trying to help in the earthquake areas. They were under pressure and they were kicked out and were forced not to work. And I should mention, like the report said, that after the earthquake, we saw some activities like construction, and usually this is not an area that women work in, especially in internationally run projects which don't help women to enter the job market, like embroidery work and hairdressing. Here I should point out to the role of the de facto powers in fighting the organization that defend the rights of women and the threats they get, even threats to be killed when they are active in the societies. Dr. Maya, you have 1 minute. International disregard and letting people down, and all de facto powers using the situation or abusing the situation to reinforce their political positions. We saw this, but here I would like to point out to social solidarity, which showed that in the different parts of Syria, we saw humanitarian and social solidarity. And had it been not to political hindrance, and maybe for the future, this we can build on, like you said, if we see a political will and good governance. Finally, I will conclude with two things. As Syrians in exile, we we're focusing not just on in-kind help, but also financial support to the NGOs, especially those that helped in the rescue, like White Helmets. We say this is better than in-kind help because we know it will take long time to get it to them, and we know it takes a lot of paperwork. So finally, as feminist organizations, or as a feminist movement in Syria, I am proud to say that we have cross-border networking before the crisis, during the crisis, or the earthquake. Also, we created a group for the response to the earthquake by a group that still exists, in which we issued many statements and we sent many messages to international organizations and tried to organize and coordinate, and we are building more partnerships for the future. Thank you so much, and sorry I took long time. I have a lot to say, but not enough time. Thank you, Dr. Maya. Very interesting comment on the gender perspective of the report and the abuse of women and abuse of women rights, and also local powers and the hegemony powers working against women. I ask report writers, they want to comment on the commentators before I open the room for Q&A. I can remind you that you can raise your hand, or by asking one in chat, or by writing in the Q&A part on the lower part of Zoom screen. We can start first. I don't know if you like to comment on some of the questions, like, did we see solidarity continue after the earthquake, the role of the UN, which was mentioned by Karam and Dr. Maya, also highlighting the issue of ownerships that Dr. Karam Hilly pointed out. I want to thank Karam and Dr. Maya. I believe that we should listen to the questions. Karam and Maya open new perspectives for the things we should look at more deeply. We are looking at governance structures and the issues related to solidarity in the 7 months after the earthquake. And this is something that we are working on. We have a field research about solidarity across Syria, social solidarity. We'll do it in the last quarter of the year. This is part of what we are working on, but we are also interested to know, we want you to know that the issues you raise will be looked at more deeply in order to have complementarity in our work. And I thank you so much for all you said during the comments. First of all, we have a question about the economic situation since 2010. You said poverty rates were 26% at that time. Can you give us an overview about the source of this number? Although the regime is usually not giving out correct numbers. I can answer that question, and I can receive any comment from a colleague. This is a technical aspect. Poverty study was based on a study of income and spending in 2009. We worked on that research in collaboration with FAFO organization, and the research was not published and will not be published, but after long discussions, there were some estimates published in 2009. It was published not in an official or report manner or format, but we, working the center, we were part of the research. And the reason for not publishing is that poverty between the 2004 and 2009, that poverty increased, especially public or general poverty. And so the number, which is not the 26, it's actually 22%. So general poverty was 22% for all of Syria. And we saw it above 40% in rural Aleppo, and Idlib was the poorest in 2009. So those numbers are based on this research about poverty. And there was no manipulation in the number, at least from the analysis perspective, which we worked on. We have a raised hand by Omar and then Dirar Al-Ali. Good evening. First of all, thank you for inviting me to this important session. I thank Rabia. I am also happy to hear my brother Hazim, and allow me to thank you for this important study. And I have some comments I would like to mention. First of all, the headline or the title, the missing development perspective. I wish to have seen a differentiation in the methodology between the areas under the control of the government and the areas that are outside the control of the government. Because no research, for the different objective reasons, cover all the aspects impacting development, and to do a continued and sustainable study in those areas that are different areas. The second point is I wished that you have separated the political aspect from the development approach. And Mr. Rabi' spoke lengthily about the political aspect, and other presenters spoke about this. But I wish you had also covered the political aspects in the areas that are outside the control of the government. I assure you, and I thank you, I assure you that the local community is the biggest and the greatest humanitarian factor during the earthquake crisis. And I thank all members of the Syrian society without any discrimination, wherever they were. The second point is I would like to, I have a reservation against what you said against the United Nations for many reasons. First of all, there are procedural things that maybe they have been hindering the distribution of aids in Syria. We have offices in Aleppo and areas close to the earthquake in Latakia, in Aleppo and other areas. We also use a non-politicized approach to humanitarian work. Added to all of this, the priorities of the donors, our donors that govern us. So I have a reservation against what was said against the UN, and I hope you can be patient enough, and generalization is not accepted at all. Can we be brief? I'm not finished. Can you be brief, please? Because we have other people. Just give me 2 minutes. Actually, the whole thing is 2 minutes. The idea that some people lifted sanctions. I had a meeting with Siemens, and they said I cannot win the Syrian market and lose the European market. So the lifting the sanctions was not real. Also, communication between the center and the governors, the message was either lost or distorted. So building the capacity and having proper communication tools is important. Data issue is very important. I also stress on what Dr. Rahabi said about women and supporting women during crisis. Another important point, which is that the aids that were coming, I would see blankets and medical or pharmaceuticals. So they should be separated. Usually donors should send materials in a separate manner, detergent separate from pharmaceuticals, from blankets. In terms of relief, I would feel sad that people in a shelter, in a school, we send students home and empty the school to create a shelter center. Always we should look forward in a sustainable manner when we do relief work. Thank you, Mr. Omar. I apologize. We want to give room for people to answer. We'll take few questions. Dirar. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for inviting me. I'm Dirar Al-Ali. I just wanted to comment on what Karam said regarding sustainability in social solidarity, especially Raqqa, Hasaka, and Deir ez-Zor. After the earthquake, the lack of sustainability is the de facto powers. We know in the northeast and northwest, there is one checkpoint only between the two regions. This checkpoint, when we crossed it towards Idlib, we were stopped near Jarablus for 7 days. When we moved towards northwest areas, first, it was difficult to get there. And we didn't see a lot of cooperation, especially that the Turkish authorities were not cooperating, although it was based on solidarity by the society and the tribes first. Secondly, and the most important part is regarding organizations. We didn't want to intervene in the Northwest because of the de facto powers that were not allowing to do so. We were supposed to take approvals from Turkish authorities or deliver the aid to them. So, sorry, the voice is not clear because of the connection. The third thing, we took a lot of risk, especially people who moved from Raqqa and Deir Zor, who moved to Idlib. The risk on the way back. Your voice is not clear. If you can focus on the mic, please. Your voice is not very clear. It's interrupting. There were risks we faced when we were coming back. The de facto authorities in the Qasad region, they were arrested when they came back after they were running to give relief. Social solidarity would have continued and would have been better, but the reason, is the de facto authorities. I just wanted to give that comment. Also, I wanted to comment on the tribal traditions. We don't allow any attack against women, and we have a special custom. Any attack on women should be killed and should not be supported by the family. Thank you, Dirar. We go to Shivan. Thank you so much. Jivan, head of human rights organization in Erbil. First of all, I don't know who is here. I don't know the people present here. Secondly, people are saying it's a purely humanitarian relief during the earthquake. It was humanitarian and sometimes it was professional. Like, for example, as an engineer, I tried to group a number of people, whether with the regime or against the regime, to create a special association. But unfortunately, there was no cooperation from people on the ground. So we would have loved organizations to work on this and to avoid this happening in the future. I just wanted to say that comment. We'll take some of the written questions. The catastrophe impacted the region. It is difficult to separate the impact from the response. Impact on neighboring countries. Another question. I wish you had taken the legal aspect of the response, both regionally and internationally, including the complications of how the UN work. It is important to take into account the lack of building code in their areas hit by the earthquake, which was a reason for the high number of victims because of the full collapse of many residential units that are not adhering to the building code. I'll take some comments and answers, or do you think I should take more questions? Enough. Let me answer. Let's answer and then we go take another round of questions. Can we comment ourselves? You can comment on a comment. Of course. Now this is an open dialogue. I just want to say first, we are not here to give answers to thousands of questions related to the earthquake. We are just trying to have a framework for analysis, the socioeconomic aspect and framework. And also, secondly, we want to see what are the questions that were not answered, which are more than the questions that we answered in the report. First of all, I would like to ask young men and women to who would like to comment or say anything on the questions asked. Can I comment, please? Just a simple comment, please. I have a comment on the presentation by Karam about confidence and social solidarity. Our center has a long history of tracking indicators related to human capital, especially social solidarity and trust that are important part of it. Also, we conducted 13 workshops across Syria and different governorates about social and economic solidarity. This is part of our work, and we will have a special report about those workshops and the outputs in the coming days about this. I just have a comment on a question related to the building codes, lack of building codes in the earthquake areas. This was one of the points stressed in the report, which is the lack of building criteria or building codes, or the fact that people were living in houses that were about to be collapsing or partially collapsed. This was a reason why we saw an increased number of deaths and wounded people in eastern Aleppo and northwestern Syria. Thank you, Muhammad. Wajdi or Muhammad Kiki, do you have any comments regarding the de facto powers? They had a negative role in the relief process. They were impeding those processes in the northeast, northwest, or even the Syrian government itself. We looked at their role. They played a negative role. One of the impediments was the slow response, and I agree with this. Kiki, do you have any comment? Of course, I have. Thank you for the comments and the questions. I just want to comment on the question of Mr. Omar. Honestly, we cannot exclude the political aspect and analyze it just as a humanitarian crisis. The political aspect is very important to analyzing the response to the crisis. Secondly, in terms of the UN issues, let's talk about the first part of the response, not just response in terms of equipment and materials needed to be delivered to those impacted, but also the issue of saving people who were under the rubble. And even 3 or 4 days later, they will become dead. So the idea was to respond to a crisis in a country that is in a conflict, whereas we saw a different response in the neighboring country from all international actors and the UN. Here I agree with Muhammad. There was a paradox between what happened in Turkey and what happened in Syria. There was a difference in the UN response between Turkey and Syria. Was clear. Secondly, there was a difference in the response between Northwest, like Aleppo and Idlib, and the one in the Syrian regime. Usually, it should be based on the needs. We saw a big need in Afrin and Idlib, and the response was less compared with the aid that went to Damascus. That was the second paradox among the countries and among the regions. Thank you, Wajdi. I just want to say one thing. Technically, there was a question about the difficulty in separating the impact. It's not impossible, but it is difficult. When we look at prices in the different regions in February, March, April, we are able to see the main factors that change between February, March, and April, and how before the earthquake and after the earthquake, we saw the difference in, for example, people needing housing and people needing building material. It meant higher costs, not just in Idlib, but also in the areas that were not hit by the earthquake. So these are issues we study, but this is a direct impact. This is the direct impact on the economy depending on the region. This is the response in the area, but the government response impacted Idlib because of the overlap. We looked at how the direct impacts overlap, but the indirect impacts are more complicated to look at. Secondly, Mr. Omar from the UN, we welcome the reservation you propose, but also you should welcome our difference in views. You said the priorities of donors. We are saying that the United Nations, and my colleague asked about the legal aspect, there are distinct legal centers, including the Syrian Human Rights Network in the Syrian different centers. They looked at the legal aspect and the delay in the UN response after the earthquake and the lack of decision and delaying the decision for later stages or the delay in the decision making. We are not saying that the performance of the UN is not just an internal decision. We know it's governed by superpowers that impact the UN decisions, but this doesn't exempt the UN from the accountability because of the lack of its role. And I ask you to read the report, because the report talks about the earthquake and its impact on Syria, taking into account the different control regions where this is we have been working for 12 years. We are not analyzing based on the control areas, but we take different control areas into account. So in the report, you would see that we talked about the political and social and economic aspects in the different areas impacted by the earthquake and depending on the different controlled areas. Secondly, we are not saying we should politicize AIDS. We are saying why AIDS is not turning into a development action. This is a very complex issue. How can the UN improve the margin of its activity? This is a big question that needs to be discussed. And how can the civil society benefit from humanitarian aids in a different way? A question that was asked by Karam in a nice way. We should all think about it deeply to see how we can have an impact. بالنسبة or Jivan, we are a webinar with 60, 70 people. So it's difficult for each to get to know each other. So we'd have wasted the first hour getting to know each other. But in a smaller groups, of course, we welcome that people introduce themselves to the participants. Finally, in terms of de facto powers, I will leave the comment to my colleagues if Karam or Dr. Maya would like to comment on this or any other issue. Dr. Maya, you have a comment, and then if you want also, Mr. Karam, if you have anything. First of all, I wonder how we can separate the political aspect from what's happening in Syria. Checkpoints were opened after the fourth day, as if all international and local parties were waiting the first 3 days where many people could be saved from under the rubble. So how can we separate political action from this? I don't know. My second comment is regarding the tribes. When I talk about the tribes, I'm talking about them from based on my knowledge. I know the traditions of the tribes. I am a member of the tribes and I know them very well. I just want to answer to Safwan that after the recent abduction of the girl from her family, 14, by people protected by the factions, the tribes in the region issued a statement justifying this abduction. How can this be in line with the tribal traditions? And you said that attacking females is something were met, and I responded to this statement by tribes because those who are justifying this event, if the daughter of a head of a tribe, they say they love each other and they went together, the girl and the man. I don't know how this aligns with the traditional tribal or tribal traditions we all know. Dirar. Sorry, it's not Safwan, it's Dirar. Karam, anything you would like to add? Otherwise, let's go to since 2019 and now we are in 2023. We are talking about cessation of military action, yes, but we are seeing higher spending on relief and there is no spending on development and early recovery. There is a big problem here. UN centers have paradoxes in the different regions. In some areas, they're working on development and recovery at a higher rate. There are countries even that do recovery and development work in regime controlled area. But having offices in Aleppo and Latakia doesn't mean having offices in Afrin or Raqqa or Idlib. So the presence of offices is always, as we know, subject to a veto and the Security Council and voting. So there are, or there is a reality. There were 19 vetoes used in Syria. It's a huge number for a country like Syria. So having offices is something, a reality we cannot deny, but it's not present in all areas. I wanted to highlight this issue because it is important regarding Dirar. I agree with him. I know that a lot of people went to help, but the temporary or the interim government stopped some aids from some areas, and some uh, because of intervention, some materials were not allowed to enter the northwest of Syria. So my question was not just about Raqqa or east and west. I'm talking about solidarity in the same area, even in Idlib or Jindiris, because of the weak governance. This is just my comment. Because of weak governance and lack of equal distribution and redundance of distribution of aids, because of this institutional problem, we saw social fragmentation, we saw competition, and we saw some hatred among people. So rather than a natural crisis leading to social solidarity, and because of bad response, we saw the situation getting worse socially. This is what I was trying to talk about. I wasn't talking about the different regions. I'm just talking about Jindiris or Afrin as an example within the same area. Some people coming during the day to take aids and going back to the camps in the evening, did it have a social impact that is different than what we expect or different than what happened? Because we saw a lot of solidarity from Europe and elsewhere. We cannot deny this, but also weak institutions had an impact, as you can see, on solidarity on the ground. Thank you. Thank you very much. Nibal Saloom. Thank you so much for the important content. I just have four quick points and I can speak at length about them. I just like to say them quickly in order not to take long time. I want to start first with the types of solidarity. Yes, uh, solidarity was great, but financial solidarity was impeded and constrained, especially from outside Syria. And in turn, the country, we saw a lot of security concerns because people were arrested or people were required to uh, go to security centers. Some people are even asked now to go to uh, security offices of the government in Sueda and Damascus. I'm just mentioning the areas I heard about, but there may be other areas too. Also, the form of response and solidarity was all short term, and we still need to think about long term solidarity and response, which we need more. Secondly, what about the more vulnerable segments in society, especially those who were wounded earlier in the conflict, and people who have disability and displaced, internally displaced people. Those people had a lot of burdens put on their shoulders. The final point is about grassroots organizations were a service provider and suddenly became in need of the services it provides. We did a short paper, 5 or 6 pages, talking about the organizations that work on women issues and the impact on them and what hindered their response and where they were responding and where they were not being able to respond. And so we should look at all the organizations working on the ground and how this was analyzed from an analysis perspective. Mr. Safwan, please stick to the shortest time possible because we don't have a lot of time left, so we can have an answer. Can you hear me? Yes, we can. I just want to talk about sources of information that the center relies on. The report is very valuable, but I want to ask a question to all our colleague researchers. How important are analysis tools if the database is not accurate? So necessarily, the assessments will not be accurate. Why I'm asking this? Because I am from Latakia, and regarding the information you are getting, I want to give 2 examples, 2 practical examples about this, and they were asked during the questions. The first one is about social or civil society and delivery of aids after the earthquake and how it happened. In Latakia, for example, the aids system was done through channels that were organized or designed before the earthquake, which was done by a de facto power, the Syria Trust for Development. So when the earthquake happened, those pre-existing channels were revived and moved to respond to the earthquake. In summary, what I want to say is that the way AIDS moved, we saw in Latakia, it was done based on de facto power instructions rather than the needs of the local community. Sorry for taking a lot of time, but one of the main channels was the Kfaria Jub Ahmar line, a line which was built during war, during the wartime. So those areas are rural areas in which simple people live. So they were given aids. After the earthquake, it was revived, whereas the earthquake hit the whole governorate. So this is one point. The second point regarding sources of information, and I put it in the questions, the issue of building codes. I just want to give one example. When the governorate of Latakia wanted to assess the damage, they sent committees, and those committees would visit a house which cost 150 million, for example. The head of the committee tells the guy, you should leave because it's about to collapse. Can you imagine the cost of leaving a house in the Syrian situation now? What would happen? People would be bribed. The head of the committee would be bribed 10 million to write a report and say that this damaged is house is not damaged and people can live in it. And so the government got inaccurate data because of this. So the data, I just want to conclude 10 seconds. The data about the earthquake in Latakia were based on a corrupt structure rather than anything else. Thank you. لميع محمد لامع. I know little time is left. Please go ahead. Thank you. I would like to thank the center. I'm close to them. I know their methodology. I would like to thank them for the information, which is a reference for us all. The first point is that the center talked about the data between 2020 and 2022, 3 months before the earthquake, and then the earthquake, and then 7 months later now. Is there recovery? Are the numbers you mentioned about unemployment and increase, have we seen any improvement after 7 months? How did the impact pan out? Also, America relieved sanctions. Are there any further details on this? You mentioned that the UN used discrimination, and you talked about this. There was a difference. Are there numbers to reflect this difference in treatment by the UNs? Finally, those study and research, what are their future plans? How can they be used? The earthquake is gone, but we have victims. If we say there are murders, we as organizations interested in public affairs or civil society, what can we do? You talked about the lack of response, or the response was not as it should be. What can we do in the future to help this improve? Mr. Omar, thank you for giving me the chance again. I'm talking about a researcher. I have a question mark on the methodology and the focus of the research. If I want to focus on the political aspect, I have to take the political aspect in Syria, government-controlled areas outside the control of the government, and the impact of the different political powers, if I want to speak politically and accurately. The comparison between the earthquake in Turkey and Syria is not accurate for the different objective reasons that you all know. If you want to do a right comparison, compare the response to the earthquake in Turkey and the areas outside the control of the government. If you can do the comparison would be more possible rather than comparing with the response in the regime controlled area. I'm just talking about the methodology of the research. It could have been more focused. Thank you. Final comment from Nidal Bitari, please. I have one question and two comments. I agree with Mr. Safwan on the AIDS issue and the impact of corruption on all aspects of the response to a situation like this crisis. But I have a question. I don't know who can answer it. Maybe Mr. Rabia. If there is a conversation with the World Bank or communication with them about the study and its results, because I live in Washington, D.C., I know the World Bank is interested in evaluating and assessing the damage of the earthquake. The final comment is, I agree with Mr. Omar that the comparison between the response in Turkey and the response in Syria is an inobjective comparison, because Syria is in a state of war and catastrophe and Turkey is a stable country. So all the objective circumstances are different. Thank you. I will read a comment from Fayha Shawash, one of those impacted engineers, she said that social solidarity has reduced the number of victims, especially that there were no equipment. And she said that the basic responsibility should not be just put with the UN, but also to the de facto authorities, which are directly responsible for what happened during the earthquake. Who would like to answer? Wajdi, please. Very quickly, I want to talk about the numbers. It's very important. Numbers are important, and let me tell you how it happened. We received numbers. What Safwan is saying is right. In Hama, we spoke about damage in 250 schools. This is what the directorate put. They said put more numbers or higher numbers to get more aids. We did a survey and we saw only 26 schools. In Latakia, same thing. The committees did wrong numbers or reports. When they were trying to enter them in the computer, it was done with carelessness. So we did a comparison between Latakia and Hama. Aleppo data were completely changed. The data from the government is different from the data we use. So the data we received from Aleppo mainly were changed based on field surveys and cross-checking. Same thing for Latakia, I agree. The lists produced by the government were not logical at all. It was careless and it was not understandable. So we relied on field surveys, and even in Hama, this included health and education and water tanks and infrastructure also were all included in our study. First of all, I would like to clarify the methodology. We took the material damage in response to what Safwan said. We took the direct material damage, buildings, facilities, number of dead, number of wounds. We didn't take any estimated value from anybody. Actually, we have a prices survey we do every month, and we estimated the value of metal and furniture and assets that need to be replaced. And this is the realistic aspect, is that we surveyed the actual damage plus the social aspect. And Mr. Omar, and I really respect you, I would love you to read the report, because you assume that we are talking about government controlled areas and you are stressing this, and it's weird. I told you we did the research in all Syria, including all control areas. Wherever the earthquake impacted, we talked about the political and social and economic aspects in a critical way, in a methodological way. The comparison with Turkey is not to say that Syria is like Turkey. We are saying that the UN issued a statement after the earthquake, 8 hours, and it's still there, that we are on the ground in Syria and Turkey, including WHO. And it took them several days actually to send the first aid that are irrelevant to the earthquake. By the way, until now, the UN says legally we were not able to intervene, although they were legally able to intervene. I don't want to talk about the size of the catastrophe created by the UN after the earthquake. I'm not saying that Turkey is in a different context. The research itself is about context. What I'm saying is that you had the potential to intervene in an area that needs more than Turkey, and you did not take a decision. And should I justify that the UN is afraid of America and Russia? This is not a justification. You have a mandate and you are saying I'm non-politicized and I intervene in favor of the society, but you didn't follow the mandate. If you cannot follow the mandate, either you apologize or you change your mandate. But you say we should understand and justify. We cannot justify for the UN. It said I'm on the ground and I'm helping, and it's all about achievements, and we saw nothing. Regarding the World Bank, and I met Mr. Nidal in Washington, there were reports by the World Bank, it was looking at the impact until 2017, between 2015 and 2017. Now they are issuing the reports. Unfortunately, they are office-based reports. In the they took pictures from satellite and they compared with similar countries, and they took prices close to the Turkish market to determine the impact, and they published a report very quickly. Actually, the way the World Bank is working in publishing reports about the region is like it used to be. In Syria, we had a remarkable team between 2015 and 2017. They wanted to understand the political structure, the interactions, they wanted to understand the economy deeply. So the World Bank currently, the way they are working is not accurate. I can say this with relieved conscience, despite all the potentials and the resources they have. Another issue I would like to comment on regarding what Safwan said. Safwan, read the report, please. We wrote all the impediments that happened to the aid, including the Syria Trust for Development, security approvals, imposing the transfer of money through certain ways. In the first few days, money had to be given through government committees. This is all in the research, and we are happy to take any details for development later. Lamer spoke about the future plans. This is, for us, this research is just an introduction, but the impacts for now, we are looking at 3 field research for evaluation. Other centers are also exerting efforts to evaluate, so we are trying to work in complementary method. This is just a report for early discussions to develop further discussions and to improve the role of civil society and discussions in the civil society. I go back to Nibal. What you said in terms of solidarity is exactly what we saw in the field research, whether it's the different short-term solidarity and the political powers were able to frustrate those civil society actors. Unfortunately, we couldn't take all the details of the vulnerable groups. We focused on displaced people, but we couldn't take the data about disabled people or people missing loved ones or wounded people. This required more effort and time, but hopefully we'll be able to focus on those questions in the future. The same thing for evaluating the work of organizations. We saw the features of civil society, and we were not evaluating NGOs' efforts. This is an effort that requires a lot of effort in the future to develop that question and answer it and address it. But the approach to the role of civil society, if it doesn't change, we will be in the same spiral. We will go in the same route and the same way. Let me give you a simple example. When we met after the earthquake, one day after the earthquake, the idea was, without talking about any development approach, because people need relief, and we agree with this 100%. However, 1 week later or 2 weeks later, the relief won, meaning that what is easier for international organization or donors is to give material in-kind aids, whereas governance and networking and connecting the different sectors, this is a complex process and needs more effort. However, like you say, every year we need more aids because those aids are practically short-term and short-sighted, especially given the characteristics of this conflict. Muhammad Kiki and Muhammad Asadi. I have nothing to add, just a quick comment about the relief of sanctions somehow. we couldn't comment on this in the report because of the lack of data, especially in the northwest parts of Syria. I just wanted to say this comment. The sanctions issue, there were financial facilities for the transfer of money or transportation and import. But the idea that this is just a short-term, it restricted a lot of facilities that could have been different. Before I conclude, I want to comment, or I received a comment from Facebook. The problem is nobody believes that there should be solutions to enter a development process. Everybody wants to kill the other, and nobody cares if the whole country vanishes. I don't know if you have any comment that the de facto powers are trying to impede any development process. Briefly, please. We don't want to end with such a pessimistic comment. We have also to give a voice to everybody, even those who are on Facebook. Of course, I agree we should give people a voice, but let me say one thing. What is happening every day inside the country is a proof that this is spirit in society, and the idea that change can be achieved and the idea of change is still there. The effort needed is much more to do the change, but the potentials are there, let me say, and this is what we are all betting on for the future. We have 1 minute to conclude. Finally, I would like to thank the research team at the SCPR and Vienna University for the report. The biggest thank is to the field team, which worked around the earthquake time, and they are still providing us with accurate data as much as possible. For the webinar, I would like to thank the commentators, the translator, and the technical team who facilitated this webinar. And the biggest thank is to the audience and the valuable questions that enrich the webinar. Thank you, everyone. We hope to see you again and in a new report. Thank you.